Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. Thank you so much for joining us for Western University's webinar with Dr. Shireen Razak on racial violence and settler colonialism. This event is sponsored by Western's Department of Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies, Western's Office of the President, and the Social Science Student Donation Fund. We welcome questions during and right after Dr. Razak's talk. Please type your questions in the Q&A section rather than in the chat. I'd also like to let you know that there is a closed caption live transcript available. Just click on CC Live Transcript at the bottom of your screen. Segoli, Jeff Tenet, Niyungyats, Bushu, Jeff Tenet, Ndijnikas, Jaganashin Dao, Nibising Nindonjaba, Deshkanzibing Ningda. I'm Jeff Tenet. I teach in the Faculty of Arts and Humanities here at Western. I'm a settler born on Huron-Robinson Treaty territory, and I currently live in London, Ontario. Although we're gathering virtually in front of our screens in many different physical locations, when the topic of our discussion is racial violence and settler colonialism, it is particularly important that we recognize the land that we are on. Indeed, wherever we are on Turtle Island, we are on Indigenous land. Here in the Canadian province known by the Haudenosaunee name of Ontario, whether the land is unceded like the Algonquin territory, where my Irish patrilineal ancestors settled in 1821, or whether it comes under the terms of a treaty such as the 1851 Robinson-Huron Treaty, like the Anishinaabeg territory on the shores of Lake Nipissing where I was born, we must be mindful of our relationships with these lands and with the peoples who have had relationships with the lands since before colonization. Western University, which is hosting this morning's event, is situated on the banks of a river that I prefer to call by its Anishinaabemowin name, the Deshkanzibi, rather than by its not terribly original colonial name, the Thames, on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabeg, the Haudenosaunee, the Lenape-Wak, and the Attawandaron peoples. These lands are connected with the London Township and Sombre treaties of 1796, and also with the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. We respect the longstanding relationships that Indigenous nations have to this land, as they are the original caretakers. We acknowledge historical and ongoing injustices that Indigenous peoples endure in Canada. We willingly and actively take up our responsibility as a public institution to do all we can to reveal and to correct miseducation about Indigenous peoples and to renew respectful relationships with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities through our teaching, our research, and our community service. I would like to pass the floor to my colleague, Dr. Erica Lawson, who will introduce Dr. Razak. Nyawako Miigwech, thank you.
Thank you, Jeff, for that wonderful acknowledgement. My name is Erica Lawson. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies here at Western. And I'm really pleased today to introduce Dr. Shireen H. Razak. Dr. Shireen H. Razak is a distinguished professor and the Penny Canner Endowed Chair in Women's Studies in the Department of Gender Studies at UCLA. Her research and teaching focus on racial violence. She's the founder of the virtual research and teaching network, Racial Violence Hub, RV Hub for short, formerly a distinguished professor of critical race and gender studies in the Department of Social Justice at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education of the University of Toronto. And that was between 1991 and 2016. She relocated to the United States from Canada in 2016. Shireen H. Razak is of Caribbean Trinidadian origin. A feminist critical race scholar, Razak has published 6 single-authored books and 3 edited and co-edited collections, as well as over 80 journal articles and book chapters. Her publications illustrate the thematic areas of anti-colonial, anti-racist feminist scholarship that she pursues. Her most recent book, Dying from Improvement, Inquest and Inquiries into Indigenous Deaths in Custody, published in 2015, explores state violence against Indigenous peoples. When I asked Dr. Razak to send us a bio, she actually just sent a snapshot of a very long and distinguished career. So I want to add, on a more personal note, that I consider myself a proud student of Dr. Razak, whose work has profoundly and personally shaped my own scholarship. I was a student in the late 1990s at OISE U2, University of Toronto, where I took Dr. Razak's classes. One was race and knowledge production, and the other was racism, law, and radical education. I still have those reading compilations from that time that I refer to when I think and prepare my own courses even now. I just want to take a quick minute also to mention a few of her amazing, outstanding work that has shaped the thinking and intellectual scholarship of a generation of scholars, including myself. I'm talking here about Casting Out, the Evictions of Muslims from Western Law and Politics, Dark Threats and White Nights, the Somali Affair, Peacekeeping and the New Imperialism. I'm also making reference to Looking White People in the Eye, Gender, Race, and Culture in Courtrooms and Classrooms, Canadian Feminism and the Law, the Women's Legal and Action Fund and the Pursuit of Equality, Race, Space, and the Law, on Mapping a White Settler Society. These important groundbreaking texts have, as I said, have shaped a generation of scholarship. And the talk today is really quite timely in light of the recent violence that we've seen over the past year and in recent weeks in the US. So I'd like to say welcome and thank you for joining us today for this important talk. And thank you so much, Dr. Razak, for being here with us today.
Thank you very much, Erica, for that. Thank you to the University of Western Ontario and to Gender Studies, but also very specifically to Erica. I'm so glad to have this connection and this renewal. We last met, I think, at a very important event, the World Conference Against Racism in 2001, which was an important year for many reasons. I'm really glad to be speaking to you today. I would like to discuss policing, racial terror, and settler colonialism. And I'd like to do so by focusing very specifically on an American case of the shooting of an Indigenous woman. What I really hope to offer is a kind of analytical frame for understanding the tremendous levels of racial violence from the state and from individual settlers. But I want to do so through a specific example. Because the example is American, I'd like to make a preliminary statement. As many of you know, I have been a scholar of Canadian settler colonialism. Now that I work in the United States and I've broadened my research agenda, I need to begin with a plea to Canadians. I hope that no one listening indulges in the idea that things in the United States are so much worse than they are in Canada for Indigenous people, Black people, other racialized groups. Perhaps especially in these past few weeks, it's very easy to make this assumption. There have been 2 mass shootings in the United States in the past 2 weeks. 8 people were killed at an Asian American-run spa in Atlanta. The victims were mostly Asian women. The shooter was white. Second, 10 people were killed in Colorado this week. The shooter was Syrian American. The sheer horror of these events and their frequency and the fact that guns are much more available in the United States than they are in Canada may easily lead to the conclusion that things are so much better in Canada than in the United States. So what I want to urge is avoid the comparison. Restrict the search for a place of innocence in which to stand. Let's not indulge in Canadian exceptionalism. Everything I described for the American context is entirely applicable to Canada, as I believe so many of you listening already know. Those who are targeted and who have lost loved ones know especially what I mean by this tendency on the part of some to believe that Canada is so much better and to find comfort in that idea. The challenge is really to think through the American example that I'm offering today and to consider what the connections are between settler colonialism, racial terror, and policing. When we begin to make sense of the connections between the deaths of Indigenous people and Black people and other racialized peoples in police custody, and we seek to understand how, for example, anti-Black racism is related to anti-Indigenous racism, there is a word that often crops up, and that word is legacies. For example, a little while ago, the journal BC Studies expressed solidarity with Black Lives Matter and anti-racist protesters around the world who have risen up to condemn the murders of Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd. The journal put it this way: the anti-Black racism that caused their premature deaths is a manifestation of the pervasive structural racism arising from the legacies of slavery and colonialism. Many have yet to pause long enough to internalize the full meaning of the phrase legacies of slavery and colonialism. For one thing, the word legacies conveys that everything is in the past. For another, we work very hard to feel that the past is indeed past. Canadians, for example, are apt to think that they didn't have plantation slavery and so are off the hook for the persistence of anti-Black racism. How many times have we heard the narrative that Canada was the destination of the Underground Railroad? The same feelings of innocence are there, the same pursuit of innocence when we discuss anti-Indigenous violence. There's a pervasive feeling that colonialism is over, or worse, that the country was actually settled peacefully, as Michael Ignatieff claimed when he was Prime Minister. We were merely misguided about residential schools, as Harper claimed when he was Prime Minister. We even had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission and even an inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women. We think we've begun to tackle the problem of systemic racism in the police, even if sometimes the commissioner of the RCMP seems a bit unsure what the concept means. Canadians, like many people, regularly move between showing concern and commitment to reform in 1 minute and utter disbelief that they're implicated in any way in another minute. So my opening plea to everyone, let's work hard together to avoid any position of innocence here. Having offered these preliminary comments about the pursuit of innocence, let me say that we pursue innocence because it is difficult to imagine and to keep in our heads the level of violence that occurs, both from settlers and from the state. We all need to do the hard work of understanding why it occurs and how it occurs. And that task begins with acknowledging that it occurs, since a key part of how it continues is through the explanation that the violence is not violence at all, but is instead rational state responses and individual responses to a genuine threat. We hear talk about the necessity of keeping order. So let me start with a statement. Indigenous and Black and brown or racialized deaths in custody continue regularly. 28-year-old Julian Jones was shot dead just last month in Tofino by the RCMP, the same community in which a woman was shot last year. Chantal Moore, a member of the Teoquat of the Teoquat Nation was shot by New Brunswick police on June 4th. 16-year-old Aisha Hudson, an Indigenous girl in Winnipeg, Manitoba, was shot by police who were responding to a liquor store robbery. The officer will not be charged. As with all such shootings, both in Canada and the US, the police and legal narrative of choice is a simple one. I felt a fear and a threat, and I had no option but to shoot. This is the narrative that I'd like to talk about today. The narrative suggests that the police response is an individualized emotional response that is unconnected to broader structures of white supremacy and settler colonialism. It is a response that is understood as a reaction. The challenge is to place this very typical response on the part of the police into a structure. And that's what I'd like to do today. Although the analytical frame that I propose works for understanding police shootings of Indigenous and Black and other racialized groups, the devil, as they say, is in the details. That is, we must move from individual response to structure, traveling along paths that are specific to each group. This prompts questions such as, how is anti-Blackness structural? How is anti-Indigenous violence necessary to settler colonialism? How are these forms of violence state-sanctioned, institutionally supported? What functions do they serve? Today, I invite you to make the connections yourself as I discuss one form, anti-Indigenous violence. We can pursue the connections further in the Q&A, and it is very hard work. As the Black Lives Matter movement has so clearly shown in the past year, policing of the colonial kind has run its course. End of story. We still, nevertheless, experience enormous trouble, and here I include myself, in working out what abolition looks like. If the call for police and prison abolition alarms you, if you can't see the options, think about what policing is in the current context. Think about the rates of Indigenous and Black deaths in custody. So before I begin, as we contemplate the end of policing as we know it, I speak here to remind what my fellow Canadians of the following. In Vancouver, Frank Paul, a Mi'kmaq man who was unable to walk the night he died and who was dragged by police to an alley on a cold, wet night and left to die. We should remember Frank Paul. Paul Alphonse, a Secwepemc man who died in a Williams Lake hospital in police custody with a print of a boot on his chest and several ribs broken. We need to remember Paul Alphonse. A host of Indigenous men and women from BC and Saskatchewan, the two provinces I happen to have studied, who were arrested for drunkenness, have died in jail, calling out for help that never comes. Anthony Dawson, a member of the Muskamek First Nation, died in Victoria, unable to breathe after he was restrained, hogtied, transported to hospital face down, likely after a 300-pound cop sat on him. Dawson died in a very similar way to George Floyd, and before him Eric Garner in New York. Did Dawson utter those famous words, "I can't breathe"? The only thing I know is that Dawson's death and the deaths of so many Indigenous and Black Canadians did not bring Canadians out to protest on the street. In fact, the Canadian legal process of choice, the inquest, and its cousin, the inquiry, typically blames those who died in police custody for their own deaths. Dawson, like Floyd and Garner in the US, was considered to be suffering the spurious disease of excited delirium. An inquest concluded that Dawson's death was accidental and brought on by an aggravated delirium. I ask you to keep in mind the stories that inquests tell of people who die in police custody, stories about a hard to manage population with too many pre-existing medical conditions, including the strange propensity to die in custody. It's a population that's dying anyway, the law tells us. I also ask you to keep in mind police shootings of Black people in Canada. In fact, if you go to my website, racialviolencehub.com, you'll find several cases analyzing Black and Indigenous death, and among them, the police shooting of Michael Elegon. Michael Elegon was a 29-year-old Black man who was shot and killed by Toronto police in February of 2012. Elegon was in the hospital emergency where he was being assessed after being apprehended under the Mental Health Act. After about 48 hours, he left the hospital on a winter day wearing only a hospital gown. He tried to go to a nearby convenience store to grab a little pair of nail scissors. The incident ends with police arriving on the scene and shooting Elegon dead. At the inquest that followed, the police narrative is the same as the one that I will discuss today. I feared for my life and I had to shoot. Black lives matter, Indigenous lives matter, Brown lives matter. As we protest and demand change, as we understand that the problem is deeply structural and connected to an ongoing white settler colonialism and the pervasive racism that colonial and slave nations require for their life's blood, let us pause to think of these deaths in Canada and connect them to the deaths we hear of elsewhere. So let me begin with the killing of L'Oreal Sinigany. On March 27, 2014, L'Oreal Sinigany, a 27-year-old Navajo woman, was shot and killed by Austin Shipley, a white male police officer who was also 27 years old, and who said he was trying to apprehend her for a suspected shoplifting. In Shipley's account, Sinigany came at me, quotation marks, with scissors. I felt a fear and a threat. I did what I had to do. Since Shipley was never charged, and the Department of Justice declined to investigate the Windsor police on the matter, concluding that there was insufficient evidence to disprove Officer Shipley's claim that he shot Sinigany in self-defense, Shipley's three-step account became the scaffold of the official story. A prototypical police narrative and virtually identical to police accounts justifying the shootings of Black men and women. And I'll just say parenthetically that on my website, Race and Deaths in Custody, what we try to do on that side is actually show the connections between all these narratives and the remarkable repetition of them in all kinds of shootings. This prototypical narrative then is really identical to police accounts justifying the shooting of Black men and women, for example. Officer Shipley's account depends upon Sinigany being reconstructed after the fact as an unstoppable force of nature, as an animal provoked. Since police shootings typically take place in less than a minute, and in the case of Sinigany in under 22 seconds, police accounts legitimizing the use of force emphasize threat and in ways that cast the person who is shot in both superhuman and subhuman terms. Inescapably racial, the scenario of a 100-pound young woman holding a pair of inch-long medical scissors, an object plainly visible to the 200-pound police officer gripping her wrists after he has wrestled her to the ground, is generally scripted as a story of a crazed woman wielding a lethal weapon, a force that only bullets can stop. I'd like to explore Shipley's killing of L'Oreal Sinigany and the ensuing police investigation as a violence that lies at the heart of settler colonialism. I maintain that police shootings of Indigenous people and the legal response to police use of force, along with everyday settler violence, are a part of the racial terror that is a central part of settler colonialism. Both the shooting and the official narratives of it as a justifiable use of force reveal the psychic and material underpinnings of a settler state, a state that continually imagines and consolidates itself as a community of whites imperiled by Indians, among others. White settler violence directed at Indigenous people lies just beneath the surface of everyday settler life, and importantly, flows through institutions such as policing, embedding itself in everyday professional routines. The extractive relations that are the basis of settler colonialism require and produce white subjects for whom Indigenous lands and bodies are the resource for white identity. Policing is one site where white men and women, as well as those aspiring to whiteness, can enact racial hierarchy on behalf of the colonial state with impunity. So let me give my argument up front, as I tend to rush through it when I realize it's taking longer than it should. To make the argument about the police shooting of L'Oreal Sinigany is illustrative of the racial terror that lies at the basis of settler colonialism, I first want to emphasize that settler colonialism is an ongoing racial project, and one that is structured by Indigenous dispossession and slavery. Settler colonial regimes require the daily exercise of racial terror, not only because dispossessed and formerly enslaved peoples must be kept in line, their communities weakened, but also because the white settler subject is an anxious subject who is compelled to assert himself in his encounters with racial others. We could gender that as well. Racial terror is productive, reassuring the settler subject and the settler state that white entitlement is protected, the racial threat contained. Settler colonialism's economic processes require and produce subjects who understand their own racial superiority in gendered ways through violence, a process memorably described by Richard Slotkin as regeneration through violence. We see more readily the macro aspects of the colonial project, resource extraction, ongoing land theft, and so on, and pay less attention to everyday extractive relationships, the ways that is in which Indigenous bodies, violated, neglected, annihilated, become the raw material for the making of the settler subject and the settler state. In those spaces where settlers must manage daily encounters with Indians, the term that is used in the United States, as is the case in towns bordering reservations, such as Winslow, Arizona, where Sinigany was shot, settlers and police assert their right to the land through anti-Indigenous violence. If the extractive relations that are the basis of settler colonialism require and produce white subjects for whom Indigenous lands and bodies are the resource for white identity, policing is one site where white men and women, as well as those aspiring to whiteness, can enact and consolidate racial hierarchy on behalf of the colonial state with impunity. In part 2 of this talk, I attend to the micro processes through which settlers regenerate through violence. I consider Shipley's account of the shooting and the official response to it, examining the narratives. I felt a fear and a threat, and I did what I had to do. The defense that was offered by Officer Shipley for the racial and colonial lines of force that they construct and the masculine colonial subjectivity they reveal. Notwithstanding the very choreographed nature of the police narrative, I suggest that we take Officer Shipley at his word. The fear of Indians and the threat that they are imagined to pose underwrite a white colonial masculinity that seeks confirmation of dominance and that is easily unhinged in the hysteria of the colonial encounter. Policing the reservation border town sets the stage for such gendered colonial dramas to unfold and for their deadly consequences to ensue. Official investigations of such events confirm the racial logic that is already embedded in the narrative, I felt a fear and a threat, and I did what I had to do, institutionalizing settler regeneration through violence. Racial violence, whether on the part of individual settlers or police, is a feature of daily life in regimes based on white entitlement to land and property. It is therefore integral to white settler society. Leslie Thielen Wilson reminds us of Fanon's observation in The Wretched of the Earth that the settlers' violence lies just beneath the skin. Unpacking 3 Canadian cases where white men killed Indigenous people who were perceived as encroaching on white settler spaces, Thielen Wilson argues that property produces racialized feeling, and perhaps madness, she adds, feelings that are the heart of settler subjectivity. She draws on my own theorization of the relation between space, subjectivity, and violence, and emphasizes that the violence that settlers are driven to commit is in order to announce and consolidate themselves as owners of the land. Ominously, both the settlers' coherence as a subject and white property interests are secured through violence. Police, entrusted with protecting the white property regime that is settler colonialism, engage in an often lethal violence that is directed at Indigenous peoples, a violence that often meets with understanding in law. If it is censored at all, the violence is attributed to individual psychopathology. You've heard talk of the poorly trained or inexperienced police officer. The violence is carefully disconnected from the racial and structural context of settler colonialism itself. As I said at the beginning, our political and scholarly challenge is to put the context back in. In the case of the police, legal and societal approbation for these acts of violence is easily secured, given that the very definition of policing is to keep in line the natives who are imagined as animalistic threats to the white property order. Police killings of Indigenous people garner little attention, in spite of the fact that proportionally in the United States, more Native Americans and African Americans are killed by police than any other group. Here, I think we should pause for a second and consider the statistics. You know, there is always manipulation around these statistics. They're notoriously complicated. But in 2016, for example, The Guardian reported that of people killed by police in that 1 year, 24 were Native Americans and 266 were African Americans. When considered relative to percentage of the population, Native Americans, who constitute 0.8% of the population, comprise almost 2% of police shootings. African Americans comprise 13% of the population and comprise 26% of police shootings. So comparable rates. So Indigenous invisibility as racial targets suggest a settler colonial dynamic already at play, where all the Indians are presumed dead or dying, and the land and resources are considered already belonging to settlers and the settler state. In effect, ghosted while still alive, Indigenous lives not only count for less, but are not even counted, an invisibility that is essential to the story of settlers as the presumed original citizens who have rightfully replaced the region's pre-modern inhabitants. The mythologized invisibility of Indigenous people requires considerable psychic and material effort. Put another way, it takes a lot of effort to disappear indigenous peoples from the landscape, consigning them to the past or as debris on the settler landscape. When European Americans speak of Native Americans, they always use the language of ghostliness, writes Renee Berglund. The indigenous must either have disappeared or be disappearing for the settler to understand that he's the legitimate owner of the land, a mythology that structures the law, both in land claims and in inquests and inquiries into deaths in custody, as I've written in Dying from Improvement. We ought to remember, perhaps, that ghosts haunt. They are the things we try to bury, Berglund reminds us, but they refuse to stay buried. They are our fears and our horrors. Mythology notwithstanding, Indians have not disappeared. And in places such as Winslow, Arizona, and you might think of parallel places for the Canadian context, they're close to 25% of the population. Adjacent to a large Navajo reservation, indigenous presence in Winslow is often greater than the census indicates. Officer Shipley is a man haunted by Indians, a man whose masculinity gains a firm footing through violence against Indians, and particularly violence against young Indian women. Violence dissolves the threat that both ghosts and live Indians pose. It serves to convince the settler of his legitimacy at the same time that indigenous people are actually, and not only metaphorically, removed or made unsovereign. An Indian fighter, in quotation marks there, turned cop, Shipley enjoyed the protection of the Winslow police force and the Department of Justice. His account of the shooting, one carefully choreographed, contributes to a collective and sanctioned white terror. So the first point that I want to make is to consider policing as Indian fighting. It is useful to think of policing as racial infrastructure, that is, as a part of the material systems that organize land theft and protect white interests. In this sense, colonial policing is state-organized Indian fighting. In keeping with Melanie Yazzi's reminder that police in towns such as Winslow assist white settlers to contain the Indian threat, we can consider policing in Winslow as a part of the infrastructural ground on which settlers' quests, both for coherence and for land, are played out. What first marks the scene of the shooting of L'Oreal Sinigani as a fully colonial and racial encounter is the familiar signpost of colonial policing, namely that it is organized around maintaining the racial lines of force of the settler town. Patrolling the streets of the settler town, as I've shown elsewhere, and you see this in my book, Dying from Improvement, maintains public space for white inhabitants, producing indigenous people as permanently out of place, or as Catherine McKittrick said of Black people, as ungeographic, herded, hunted, evicted, and marked for slow death. The police knew that they were looking for what they called on their police radio an Indian woman shoplifter on a beer run. The category announced over the police radio, and one that Shipley himself revealed as a part of his everyday lexicon when he unselfconsciously characterized Sinigani as killing me for a beer run. If we take Shipley at his word that he felt a fear and a threat from a small, defiant young woman with a blunt pair of small scissors for a weapon, and we put into context his repeated encounters with Indians, several of which were marked by the defiance of indigenous youth, we can note the infrastructure of policing in which such scenarios of imperiled white masculinity are played out. The streets and the prison are two sites where the contours of the racial order are written on the bodies of Indigenous women and men, and in specific ways on the bodies of Indigenous children and youth. In a reservation border town, which in the United States, I should explain, is a town that is adjacent to a reservation and not a town that is adjacent to the actual border between the United States and other countries. Policing, barely altered from its 19th century form, has as its primary objective the disciplining and surveillance of Indians and their repeated eviction from the settler town. Shipley's daily life as a police officer reveals as much. The ongoing theft of land and the racial terror that accompanies it are very easily traced for the town of Winslow and surrounding areas. Bruce Johansson and Roberto Mastas trace this continuing theft, writing, for example, of the institutional, cultural, and physical violence directed against the Navajo people over centuries. We can see the acres of land stolen by white settlers, the intensified resource extraction on Indian land of the late 1970s, when coal and uranium formed the basis of an energy policy that required an even more vigorous pursuit of Indian land than in earlier decades. We can also see an escalating racial terror that accompanied an anti-Indian movement comprising of agencies of the federal government as well as settlers. Between 1973 and 74, for example, the bodies of 10 Navajo were discovered, among them bodies of middle-aged men who were sexually mutilated and tortured. These mutilation murders of the 1970s were clearly understood by Indigenous people, not as the acts of crazy kids. In the case of these murders, some juveniles were arrested, but they were part of a whole racist picture. The tapestry of racial violence includes the activities of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the justice system, the public health system, the multinational energy companies, and everyday encounters with white settlers. Johansson and Mastas are two authors who meticulously document the removal of Indian children from their families, the sterilization of Indian women, the denigration of Indian children in the school system, the insidious effects of a colonial police force dedicated to targeting activists. These are mechanisms that by the middle 1970s enabled 63% of Indian-owned agricultural land to be cultivated by non-Indians, leaving little doubt about the full-on colonial project in operation and the tremendous racial violence required to sustain it. The epicenter of such patterns of accumulation by dispossession is the border town, those spaces that are marked by a sustained and violent encounter between white settlers and Indians. The border town, as one scholar put it, is a place where you can get away with anything against Indians. The reservation border town, which is a product of the confinement of Indigenous peoples to reservations, offers a very clear example of the racial infrastructure on which settler colonialism rests. You can see, for example, as the Diné historian Jennifer Dennett-Dill has written, the historical and lived experiences of Indigenous people in these towns and the tremendous racial violence required to maintain them. These are towns that have spatial arrangements that emerged as a result of land dispossession, and that Cheryl Redhouse Bennett describes as predatory arrangements that generate and require considerable racial violence. we have to think about the racialized violence that is needed to protect the boundaries between settlers and Indians. As Barbara Perry has written, the very motive and intent of racialized violence is to protect carefully these boundaries. It is a purposive process of policing the line between white and not white. It stands then as both punishment for those who dare to transgress and those who are considering it. If, by the way, you want a Canadian example of this kind of marking of space, you can go to the commissioners of the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry to think about how they wrote about the killing of Helen Betty Osborne by 4 white men in Depah, Manitoba. So, although research into border town violence is sparse, we should note in particular the gendered pattern of the violence, and that little has changed about this pattern for a century. It is white men's violence, both the police and settler violence, that is directed at Indigenous men and women alike. Racial violence emerges in the context of white claims for land and resources and has remained constant up to the present. For instance, Tracy Bryn Voiles has charted how sexual violence against Indigenous women skyrocket with the influx of white miners in reservation border towns. American Indian women also have the highest rate of violence perpetrated against them. The same is true for Canada. Amnesty International, for example, has reported widespread police harassment and shootings and young men who regularly cruise to target Indigenous women in border towns. Canadians, of course, will be very familiar with this from the inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women. Although Native Americans account for 25% of Winslow's population, they average nearly 64% of the arrests. Indigenous youth and women have a particular place in these statistics. If sexual violence from white men and police is not empirically validated for Winslow, the Navajo community itself expresses tremendous fear for its girls and women when they venture into Winslow. In fact, one very uncharitable commentator at a Navajo public forum I attended blamed Sinigani for having gone to live in Winslow in the first place, knowing what the town was like for young Indian women, while another speculated that Sinigani might have been one of the women that police routinely take outside of the city to rape. Although it is hard in these informal conversations to confirm sexual violence and to delineate the role of the police from internal sexual violence, it is clear that internal violence within Indigenous communities is linked to state violence in complex ways. It is critical then to consider what my colleague Mishwana Goman has called a multi-scalar imprinting of colonial power, all the various sites in which it happens over time. So let us get back to Shipley. White men are an important link in the chain of events that culminate in excessive violence in the lives of Indigenous women. The asymmetrical intimacies of the border town reveal that what we know as the excessive force of police towards Indigenous people is a daily gendered enactment of colonial power on the part of white men. The police files detailing Shipley's encounter with Indians record the traces of the fear, memory, and desire of the colonial subject who is attempting to bury what cannot be buried. An organized and continuing dispossession unfolds in everyday and institutional extractive relationships between white men and women and Indians. This is a dispossession in which policing has a central role to play. Institutionally sustained and integral to the extractive economy and spatial arrangements of settler colonialism, Shipley's use of force against L'Oreal Sinigany is important to the circuit of ongoing dispossession, assuaging colonial fears and anxieties, and simultaneously consolidating dispossession. The colonial underpinnings of Shipley's encounter with L'Oreal Sinigany are visible from the outset. If Sinigany arrived at the encounter already scripted in by the police on their radio as an Indian on a beer run, Shipley came to it as a white man drawn to guns and to Indians. He enters the scene as a prototypical Indian fighter at risk from wild Indian. At first glance, it's tempting to attribute Shipley's relationship to Indians to white extremism. And you saw examples of this in the storming of Capitol Hill recently. Shipley was, in fact, connected to one of the groups who stormed Capitol Hill, the 3%ers. Photographed at an earlier event wearing a T-shirt of the 3%ers, which is a group organized around the constitutional right to bear arms, Shipley can be seen as someone whose allegiances are to what Kathleen Belew has described as the white power movement and paramilitary America. Now, Belew is careful to note the expansive and contradictory category that is denoted by the term white power movement. It's very important, as an insightful reviewer of this article of mine pointed out, Shipley does not have to be a member of a white nationalist right-wing group, although he was, but he does not have to be a member of such a group to fulfill the colonial role that he plays. His allegiance to the 3%ers merely confirms the colonial features of his character. One has only to reflect on the historical origin of the right to bear arms and the concomitant movement against big government to note the colonial underpinnings of such beliefs. A land-race-arms nexus lies at the core of white nationalism, and there's little doubt that Shipley found himself comfortable with its chief tenets. It is difficult to untangle the white extremist and white nationalist from an ordinary patriot, and equally to separate extremist anxieties and anger from the resentment that emanates from an ordinary white entitlement. Indeed, as Indipal Grewal has argued in her discussion of mass shootings in America, the angry white Christian man who sees himself as dispossessed from his rightful place of power in the nation and exerting the sovereignty given to him by virtue of his gender and race is now so familiar a figure that when mass murders occur, the killer is simply called a shooter and not a killer or a murderer or a criminal. Shipley then would seem to personify the unexceptional white subject for whom the Indian remains the archetype of all those who are imagined and experienced as threat to white settler entitlement. Rather than extremist, the Indian fighter and the Indian fighter turned cop should be seen as foundational figures in the national imaginary, inhabiting and structuring the institution of policing, among other things. Indeed, Shipley's record as police officer offers glimpses of this frustrated colonial desire and the violence it inspires. The figure Richard Slotkin describes as the subject for whom Indians lurk everywhere. You see this in Shipley's record. He was constantly arresting and chasing after indigenous youth. He demonstrated a volatility, slamming girls against the squad car, etc. He was by no means exceptional. To place this imperiled whiteness and masculinity within a more collective context, we can consider what does daily policing entail in Winslow, Arizona. And what it entails is a relentless cycle of evicting indigenous people from the town. Processes that make the white settler subject, it's his masculinity as well as femininity, and we might think about that as well. If Shipley's service record offers evidence that he was a haunted man, an aggressive police officer who was very easily provoked and who had a particular interest in confirming his power over Indians and over young Indian women in particular, it also confirms that the violence was deeply sanctioned. Shipley's record of multiple incidents of force against Indians did not overly trouble the police department, inviting only minor rebukes. He was often required to complete diversity training, presumably because all of these use of force incidents involved Indians. When the violence finally ended in loss of life, the department offered its assistance in constructing the legal basis for his exoneration. So let me, in these last minutes, talk about the actual encounter that occurs and the structuring role of racial logic. It was a mere 22 seconds from the time Officer Shipley made contact with Sinigani to the time he fired his gun 5 times and killed her. Police typically defend shootings, and they do this in the shootings of Indigenous people, Black people, in fact, in all the racialized shootings. They typically defend shootings with recourse to a codified narrative about the use of force. They talk about things like edged weapons and the 21-foot rule, and a newly emerging discourse about persons in mental health crisis in very formulaic ways that frame the victim as a threat, emanating from the irrational behavior of a mentally ill person, a threat that only deadly force can contain. And we know all of this for the past 25 years. It is easy to spot regular police coding schemes in the police narration of the videotape of the shooting of L'Oreal Sinigani, because Shipley was wearing a cop camera. This videotape became central to the investigation. The 22 seconds that elapse between the time Shipley first encounters Sinigani and when he fires 5 bullets is narrated second by second, and each second becomes an event that conveys professional action on the part of the police. So police, if you read these narratives, you will think that the whole thing is unfolding over a rather long time. Shipley describes L'Oreal in ways that present her as a crazy wild animal whom he had to subdue. She is described as lunging at him, as surviving even the bullets and still managing to hold her body off the ground. She's rendered as a force that will not stop coming even after 5 bullets. She's rendered as threat subsiding. That is what the police account reveals. And so what she is reduced, as Judith Butler wrote of how Rodney King was described 25 years ago, she's reduced to a phantasm of white racist aggression. Colonialism, Maida Yegeneglu reminds us, is structured by unconscious sexualized processes where fantasy and desire play a fundamental role. The colonial subject is constituted through an encounter with the racial other, becoming, through an active denial of the other's difference, but nonetheless disturbed and haunted by masculine dreams of possession. In Shipley's narrative, police narrative defending himself, he narrates himself as a professional who was confronted by a wild Indian, a professional who had to face an irrational savage. He narrates himself as giving verbal commands, using the soft holds technique. These are all constructions in the aftermath that enable us to understand Shipley's shooting of Sinigani, not as a racial shooting, but as professional practice. Sinigani has to be described then as an animal. She's actively resisting, she's making furtive movements, she's aggressively walking, her demeanor is blank. We see prescription pill bottles falling from her purse. That just confirms what she is. Sinigani is narrated as an animalized body that feels no pain, a body that holds within it an intrinsic violence. What gives the story its appeal, as Alan Feldman memorably observed with respect to Rodney King, is unfinished history as mise-en-scène. We might consider then the unfinished history in which Shipley, a white man and a police officer, and Sinigani, a Navajo woman, both feature. The ongoing extractive regimes and the racial terror on which they depend, and the colonial subjects whose anxieties are assuaged and who regenerate through violence. Let me conclude then. Colin Dayan has powerfully argued that white vulnerability to Black savagery is a baseline narrative in the law, whether with respect to police shootings or to cruel and unusual punishment. This is also the narrative that fuels gun culture and gives rise to the Second Amendment's right to bear arms. Commenting on Dayan's book, The Law is a White Dog, discussing the legal rituals that transform prisoners into unpersons against whom all force is justified, Angela Davis observes that the logic of prisoners as less than human shows us how the ghosts of slavery animate institutions. If we see the afterlife of slavery in institutions and police shootings, both in their frequency and in police impunity, how might we understand the police shooting of a young Navajo woman and the legal narratives that justifies? Although it is certain that a justice system that is organized around the disposability of Black bodies sweeps up in its ambit all racialized persons, when the target is a young Navajo woman, it is necessary to consider what settler colonialism has to do with the violence that Shipley enacted and that the law gave approval to. Settler colonialism is an ongoing project that preserves intact its colonial, spatial, and legal structures. Dispossession continues apace, with extraction as the engine that drives the racial project of accumulation. We can expect then that both the ghost of slavery and the ghost of settler colonialism animate institutions such as prisons and policing. What I have argued is that with its emphasis on extraction, a white settler society targets indigenous land and indigenous people. In this regard, police shootings of indigenous people and the legal response to police use of force, along with everyday settler violence, are a part of the racial terror that is a central aspect of settler colonialism. As an ongoing racial project of accumulation, settler colonialism requires the enforcement of colonial lines of force. This is abundantly in evidence in the reservation border town, where policing entails the eviction of the native from the settler town, as Fanon put it, a perpetual drawing of the lines of power between settlers and natives. A colonial logic and affect identified long ago by Frantz Fanon for colonial Algeria, where the settler imagines that he is threatened at every turn by the native, circulates. In the settler's psyche, as in the streets of the border town, wild Indians are everywhere and can only be controlled through force. There is plenty to indicate that Officer Shipley undertook his daily duties within such a colonial imaginary. As Richard Slotkin has shown, the Indian fighter remains a central figure in American national mythology, requiring settlers to bear arms and to defend white property through violence. As Indian fighter turned cop, Shipley is able to count on institutional support for his activities. Indeed, what I argue is that Indian fighting is his job. The story in police shootings of I did what I had to do and I felt a fear and a threat official statements made by Officer Shipley in referring to his shooting of L'Oreal Sinigany is a story that is powered by race. It is dependent on the idea that Indians always pose a threat to the settler, a threat that only considerable violence can resolve. Scripting himself as imperiled and sustained institutionally for doing what he had to do in the wake of such a racial threat, Shipley can exercise force against Sinigany with impunity. I want to give the last word to L'Oreal Sinigany. In the 22 seconds of the police encounter, captured on the cop camera, one of the first things I imagine I see in her face is fear. The last thing I imagine I see is defiance. Initially walking away from Shipley, who pursues her and throws her to the ground, she stands up and begins to walk towards him, apparent determination in her stride. I think of this moment as one that shares the sentiment of the hashtag, "If they gun me down, which picture would they use?" The inevitability of the moment, the end that those who are racially targeted anticipate, finally comes. Is this refusal a final bringing to an end of a life of endless confrontation, a defiant inhabiting of the category of disposable? Even as I imagine refusal, I think of my own stakes in the story. The sources that I mine for police narratives that are discussed here do not give up easily any insight into L'Oreal Sinigany's humanity or her suffering, but they do reveal the contours of a colonial encounter, one that is structured by violence and terror. Yet I betray L'Oreal Sinigany if I don't find ways to resurrect the person who was killed, the person who struggled with racial terror and who may have found this last moment to confront it. Constructed by the police as animalistic threat who rises up after 5 bullets to confront a police officer seeking to apprehend her, I want to rewrite this narrative, leaving an image not of superhuman aggression, but of an insistence on being recognized, and perhaps a taunt and despair. I am still here. Thank you for this, and I would be very happy to take questions.
Thank you, Dr. Razak. That was an amazing and moving and powerful talk, and I think you've given us all a lot to think about. So I invite questions from viewers. You can put them in the Q&A, and I already have one here. So from Ezra Ari, we have, thank you. It was such a privilege to listen to your talk. This question is not directly related to Indigenous people, so I understand if it is not addressed. Do you think that the perception of Muslim women as oppressed by some white feminists who have supported the Western troops, their violence in the Middle East to save Muslim women from wild Muslim men can be perceived as an extension of settler colonialism?
Whoa, that, yes, well, as some of you seem to know, that is the other part of my work. And for me, everything I work on bleeds together into a kind of organized global white supremacy. And so I do make connections between what happens to other groups and what happened to L'Oreal Sinigany. And the connection that I make is this white bid for land and resources and supremacy. And that for me is where the connection lies. So my focus is always trained on the sort of white subject who is enacting and protecting white interests in various ways. And in fact, as you may know from my book, Dark Threats on the Somalia Affair, that white subject is roaming through the world, protecting and owning everything. And violence plays a fundamental role in that.
Thank you. Well, we're waiting for other questions. I actually have one.
Okay.
I was teaching, I taught Hannah Arendt, or from the last chapters of Hannah Arendt's The Origins of Totalitarianism this past semester, and she cautions at the end of her chapter on ideology that even though terror is used by totalitarian governments, that we should be reminded that also liberal democratic governments can use some of these strategies. So I was thinking about how terror can, going back to your comments at the beginning about innocence, how Canadians think of themselves as innocent, and how terror can also be used to co-opt or make complicit white settlers in this structure, because you're either going to be protected by the police or you're going to be potentially terrorized. So you can either buy into the system or not buy into the system. And I wondered if you had anything to say about that.
You know, it's interesting. I've started in a book I've just recently finished on anti-Muslim racism. I've actually started to put the word terror in quotation marks everywhere that it occurs, which copy editors really hate, but which makes a point. And the point is this: the terror that is sort of that I'm talking about here is a terrorizing of indigenous peoples and other racialized groups that works to secure white property interests. So it can't be secured in any other way. It has to be secured through this way. And so I think once you're working through that frame of what terror does and what it is, you sort of confront the settler subject who is protected through these activities, and protected materially and psychically, because you get to carry on with your extraction, but you also get to feel like you're the legitimate settler subject, which is very important. I'm very focused on this kind of structure of feeling that is settler colonialism.
Thank you. I have a question here from Kate Koricki. Thank you, Shireen. You brought me to the edge of tears for the awfulness of it all. You no doubt are familiar with the killing of Colton Boushie in Saskatchewan, shot in the back of the head by the white farmer Gerald Stanley, who was protecting his land and family from a young Indigenous man and his friends with a flat tire. Stanley was declared innocent of murder. The excavation of the structural scaffolding of white racism is so important to understanding the continuous processes of expressing it, and I thank you for the lesson. I don't know if you have anything that you wanted to add to that, to the Colton Boushie case.
Well, thank you for the comment. I think it's absolutely right. And that case, I'd refer you actually to Leslie Phelan Wilson's arguments on that case. But it is so clear that it is this protection of, this is my land and I have to protect it from the Indigenous threat. It is so absolutely clear that sometimes you think to yourself as a scholar, you think that maybe you're kind of going a little bit mad because it's so obvious what this is, what kind of colonial period we're in. It's 19th century. It's very much, this is white land and you don't get to be on it. And so, yes, I'm very taken with that case. And maybe it's a good time to sort of remind you of what I sort of opened with, which it is more than annoying, it's very worrying, this sort of pursuit of Canadian innocence. And Canadians need to sort of focus on where, in fact, you see this absolute settler entitlement protected through violence. And the law is very central to confirming that.
Thank you. I have a question from Chris Ralston, who thanks you for your wonderful talk. And she would like to know if you could elaborate a bit about what the end of the police as it currently stands might look like. She acknowledges that's a hard question to address.
I think we have plenty to sort of look to for trying to imagine that. There's certainly no end of scholars. From Angela Davis onwards, but there's a very strong movement for abolition, and we can look to them to understand what it is about. But what I note about abolition, I think there's a kind of emotional as well as intellectual problem with it. So the emotional problem is people start feeling panic because they start thinking, what are you actually advocating here. No policing. Would you really want to be without policing? Look at who, the shootings, etc. So I think we need to recognize those two things, the emotional end of it and the political argument for it. Bring them together, in fact, because we have been made to think about the abolition of police as an impossible idea. We've been trained for that. We cannot imagine another way to organize society that isn't premised on extraction and on policing the people that we're stealing from. And so that's the challenge. But you know what? We're not alone. There are so many terrific scholars and activists and groups, not least Black Lives Matter, but certainly Idle No More, all of these movements telling us very carefully, in no uncertain terms, there is another way to organize life. Organized killing of those, deemed threats is not the only way, but it is the only way if you're going to keep this society as a settler colonial one. That is for sure. So it's a big challenge, but I say to everybody, read. There's a lot there.
Thank you. We now have a question from Nicole Kaniki, who also remarks, what a brilliant presentation, and thank you so much for your work. How do we as scholars better contribute to the changes needed in these public systems perpetuating harm? I feel like we sit around and theorize so much in academia, but these discourses do not reach where changes need to happen.
Well, professors are always a little bit defiant about this kind of thing, because I've had to say to my students for 25 years, Erica will remember this, I constantly say that resistance is not simply in the demonstration out on the streets. We are scholars, and what is it that we do? We offer an analysis of how power operates, and we need to circulate that. We need to actually offer that framework for understanding of events. We need to do it widely. It plays an important role in letting people know, for example, that the violence that we see is how settler colonialism operates. Scholars can do that, can take a role in that. So I hope I'm not sounding defensive, but I'm actually really promoting at this point that we actually sit in front of our computer screens and write about and talk about and continue to circulate narratives of resistance. That is what we do best.
And you have done an amazing job of that, Dr. Razak. I have a question from Des Yamutal, who writes, well, I agree that settlers' violence is an ongoing project that for power control, how do you view those from the minority groups involved in the task of policing and therefore participating in the process?
Well, it's absolutely true that we are all invited to the party. We are all asked to be part of settler colonialism and to participate in the violence as much as possible. That's why I use the phrase white aspiring. And there's perhaps, I don't think that there is a unique role for other racialized peoples to play, because everyone's invited to the party. Everyone is not being asked to sign on to the settler project, is actually being told if you don't sign on, there'll be penalties. So there's clearly sort of a way in which policing occurs and everyone's involved. You're not just going to see white police, for example, but there is a kind of white subject position that is held up as the ideal settler position. And people of racialized peoples have to think about the terms and conditions under which we're invited to the party. And that bears thinking, it bears serious thinking, because, there's a lot to figure out here. So I would just say that we have to just think about how we are each invited to be complicit with the project.
Thank you. I have a question from Stephanie Brocklehurst, who thanks you for your powerful analysis that you've shared with us today. So she writes, you noted earlier in your talk that we must move from individual response to structural organization against the extractive relations of settler colonialism. But given that your research exposes you to the continued violence of the settler state, how do you as an individual manage the emotional weight of your scholarly work and the tragedy of violence?
Probably not very well. I mean, I often get asked this question, and I often try, my first impulse is to say, well, you know, my troubles are pretty minor compared to other groups. But still, I think it is important to think about how writing and thinking about the violence operates on our own psyche. And I think one of the things I really endlessly worry about is that I will not completely grasp it or feel it, because there'll be so many things blocking it. After all, my personal life is not as violent as the lives of the people I write about. And so that is automatically a kind of strange position to be in that I really kind of worry about, because I will then be so structurally vulnerable to the denial of this violence, to thinking it doesn't really happen. So I think that is the risk that I bear. I do have another impact on me that I actually, frankly, don't like to think about. It's not a very good thing to say, but I do wonder about the sense of personal threat that I face or feel, and also the overwhelming sense of complicity that one feels. And theoretically, I know I'm complicit, but it's quite another job to figure out how. So those are all the things. But the emotional plane, which is, I think, what you're asking about, you know, like many scholars, I try to handle it by intellectualizing it, which you know, fails on occasion. So I don't really have any wisdom on that in that regard, except that it is quite a job, and this is why I keep talking about innocence. It is quite a job not to race to innocence, as one of an article I wrote with Mary Lou Fellows describes. It's really something not to try and race automatically to the good side. And although I write about it endlessly, it's something that's very hard to achieve.
So we still have we still have a little bit of time for questions if anyone wants to add a question to the Q&A. Maybe even just gathering a couple of the questions together here, Dr. Razak, I think about when we teach, I teach to my students and they struggle with their own complicity and what can be done. And I wonder how you deal with that in your teaching, when you're teaching students and getting them to think about how we can't help but be complicit, and yet nonetheless we need to do things. We need to struggle with that.
I'm not sure if you're asking how how I deal with students who find themselves in their psyche, their emotional turns. I mean, I've had the privilege both at the University of Toronto and here at UCLA to teaching a widely diverse group of people, all critical scholars often. You know, so I'm not in the position of many of my colleagues. Not often in the position of many of my colleagues who are teaching students who are somewhat resistant to this idea that they're complicit. I'm actually always teaching people who start off by saying I'm part of it, but who emotionally, I think in the classroom, that is a really difficult thing, is to deal with sort of people's very differing situations and to not get into a game of comparing, to try to sort of push an analysis that is structural, but at the same time attends to the emotional. I think one thing in my teaching that I always wish I could sort of improve, and in my writing, is that I often spend nearly all the time on something one of my students once said is the evil that white people do. But I spend all of my time on sort of the structures of white supremacy, etc., and not enough time on what resistance to it helps us to see and feel. And I think that perhaps is the only tip that I offer myself. Pay more attention to the scholars who are actually sort of thinking seriously of this and managing to kind of render racialized peoples not as acted upon, but as actors in this drama. I think that is something that will help a lot pedagogically and intellectually in the writing. But really seriously, I can't pretend to sort of do that well. I feel like that's something that I have to keep sort of working at much harder.
Thank you. I have a comment in the chat from Hafida Ben-Sharif. I believe that colonialism justifies what it does and considers doing it in self-defense. And Hafida would like to know what you think of that.
Yeah, there's no question at all that is how dominant groups actually protect themselves by understanding that what they're facing is animalistic threat. Loreal Sinigani can only be an animalistic threat. We know that there are wild Indians out there. We know that there are violent Black men out there, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That is exactly the structure of feeling that colonizers are in. And the thing about this is, you've stolen the land, you claim the privilege, you claim the superiority. There's a way in which that has to be psychically protected by assigning everybody else, racialized peoples, the role of threat, of animalistic threat. So that is definitely how it proceeds. And I think I just try to keep an eye on the fact that this is very deeply psychically structured.
Thank you.
And although I'm not a psychologist or psychoanalyst, I do want to think about this very deep structure that we inhabit and confront.
Thank you. I have a question from Halid Doglu. Thank you so much for your talk. I wanted to ask a question regarding the role of visibility, invisibility, and fear in relation to white terror. When these murders are made visible, they are always filtered through particular state narratives that render, as you mentioned, the humanity and the fear of victims intentionally invisible and render hypervisible the terror or the fear of the police officers instead. I'm wondering if you think this plays a role in sustaining the complicity of the white settler populace, and if so, how might we flip this script?
That's a really wonderful question, because it goes to the heart of what I feel we have to think about. That's why I said at the beginning, when Shipley says, I felt a fear and a threat, and I did what I have to do, we should take him at his word. He's feeling that, all settlers are feeling that. The narrative of sort of animalistic threat that is coming at him is so central to how he understands where he is and who he is, that the sooner we reckon with that, the better. That is an actual feeling. Fear and threat then are social constructions that are quite necessary to settler colonialism. As I said at the beginning, the settler subject is an anxious subject. And that is because, anxiety is at the base of protecting this superiority. And so I think the deep emotional structure of that is something that I'm terribly preoccupied with, because, I started my career as an educator, not in the university, not as an academic. And I was always struck by how deeply organized these feelings are, that they're so hard to, in fact, society works so hard at producing these feelings that we can't interrupt them very easily. They're just there in movies, in the actions of police and everything. They just produce this whole idea of, a nice, legitimate, secure population who is threatened by wild Indians, people of color, Black men, etc. And we have to recognize that this is a constant production in 1,001 ways. And how do we interrupt it?
I have one last question here for you, Dr. Razak, from Wendy Pearson, who is the chair of Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies. Wendy Pearson asks, it's not a question as such, but they are wondering about the issue of teaching representations of violence against Indigenous or other minoritized people without risking traumatizing students, both those who identify with the targets of the represented violence and those who do not. For example, Wendy's tried teaching the documentary Two Spirits about the murder of Fred Martinez. But they worry about that it's particularly traumatizing to Two-Spirit and trans students.
Yeah, this is a really huge worry. I really can't claim that I've sort of done that right. I think trauma is in the classroom all the time, and it's in the writing as well. I have myself made errors in how I've written about things, etc. Yes, I mean, we need to recognize that these things are traumatizing to read about, to say, etc. I'm always struck, though, trauma. I have so much worries with that category because I'm always struck by who is traumatized. And I'm thinking about the way in which narratives of violence, how do they traumatize people and who do they traumatize? We have to really sort of think about that without sort of saying, tough luck, you're traumatized, let's get on with it, which actually was my initial reactions as a professor is, look, this is important, get over it, let's go on. This, of course, is not the right thing at all. One has to really think seriously about how the visuality of things, the narrative itself, re-traumatizes. At the same time, it offers a place for the subject to claim, the dominant subject to claim, that he or she is traumatized by the violence, but not implicated in it. And so that's a kind of pedagogical challenge that I think we have to constantly face, is how to find ourselves in the violence, acknowledge the trauma to groups, very specific groups in very specific ways, and try to dig ourselves out of that. And I throughout my career, I always kept trying to dig out of it intellectually. But I recognize myself how impossible that is so often in the classroom to do. I can't sort of retreat. I used to say to people, well, here are the statistics, or here's the narrative, or please look at this more carefully, or do a close reading, or something like that, and I don't want to turn the classroom into a place of kind of therapy. It's very ill-suited to that. Professors are very ill-suited to that role. I want to really emphasize that. So I think we just have to search for a critical pedagogy that acknowledges the enormity of the violence and also acknowledges that the classroom is not free space. As my dear friend Patricia Montour always used to say, look, this is not a safe space, and there's no reason why it should be. It cannot be made safe space. All we can do is sort of try and control some of the conditions of communication. So I really don't have fully the answers on that, in spite of spending 25 years teaching in a faculty of education. I feel that I think in my writing and in my teaching, that is a problem. That is a huge problem.
I would thank you so much for the generosity that you have shared, what you've shared with us today, for your amazing talk and your wonderful responses, thoughtful responses to the questions. I'm just going to do a little very quick plug here for two future gender studies events. On Monday, we have our undergraduate conference, Flaunting It. And on April 16th, Kate Koricki will be talking about Polish women contra the Catholic Church. So I'll just leave that with you. And again, I would like to thank Dr. Razak and Dr. Pearson. Are you here to did you want to say? Dr. Pearson is the chair of the Department of Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies.
So I'd just like to second Helen's thank you. Really appreciated the talk. I'm sorry I missed the beginning of it, but sometimes you get double booked. But what I did hear, and I think I heard most of it, was wonderful, and really appreciated you being available to give the talk and to talk about things that are so important to us here, and that are really, really important to everything we do pedagogically and intellectually at the university, and really trying to make a difference in the world we live in. So I think everything you've had to say has been really important from that perspective, and it's really been great to have you as a speaker in this series. So thank you very much. And thank you everybody who came to listen and attend. Some really great questions, and it's been a really great day.
Thank you.